Hello everyone, Hantiers and bibliophiles.
Welcome to Biblio Sinensis.
Alright, this is the podcast for readers and tea drinkers, and we're just going to build a community and camaraderie when it comes down to reading.
And just to let you guys know, no shame if you guys are not experienced readers. We don't care if you read slow, we don't care if you read fast, it's all good.
This is not a serious podcast. We are here to laugh at ourselves lovingly. So for our first ever podcast, we thought we would talk about the interesting subject of reading multiple books at a time. Do you do it?
Yeah, I am guilty of it. I will go through one chapter and pop into another book for another chapter.
Okay.
It's like flipping channels on TV.
For me, I have different methods. I usually find myself reading about probably 4 to 5 books at a time. I don't know if anyone knows this, but I'm actually an instructor and an after-school teacher for my day job. So I find myself having to read material all the time that's not necessarily pleasurable, but, I pace myself by putting in those yummy little morsels of good reads in between.
Well, I guess we could talk about what it takes to be a good reader. What is a reader? Let's start with that.
Okay.
When we actually pick up a book, we tend to just show interest in the book. People are synergetic with a movie or a show that they've actually seen, and they just flip pages and they start realizing that they might have a taste for, a certain genre, like Jurassic Park with Michael Crichton. People start following, Michael Crichton's career and just actually enjoy shows like Westworld and such, and vice versa with his other books. And you come to grips that sometimes you may not even like those shows, but you like the books. I know at the time when said movie came out, I wasn't into Jurassic Park when I read it when I was a kid. I was more into Neil Gaiman. And that brought a huge interest and diversity in my palette for stories and fiction. Mm-hmm. If you guys know anything about Neil Gaiman, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys know him now, thanks to American Gods.
And Coraline.
Definitely Coraline.
And then the Graveyard book, which I believe they were working on a series, but it's been stalled recently.
Yeah, you kind of understand that Neil Gaiman enjoys writing scene per scene. Mm-hmm. And when you actually understand him, you kind of enjoy a lot of his comic books. Mm-hmm. And for those that have attention spans for mostly comic books, I'm pretty sure you all know what it's like to hop onto a book and you tell yourself, why can't I finish one whole book?
So, it's funny you mentioned Gaiman because I actually read the Graveyard book in 3 different formats. I did the audiobook, which was fun to hear. It's always a treat to hear him read his books because he just gets so into it. And then I also read the actual book, just physically have a copy, and I read it. But honestly, I didn't really grasp all the little hidden treasures of the plot that he was trying to emphasize until I actually read the comic book.
Makes sense. I know that when I actually started with Neverwhere, I had visuals over what the characters might have looked like. I understood their accent when you read the book, but when you saw the comic books and you saw how the characters were portrayed, you kind of got this brand new perspective mm-hmm. to what we were supposed to actually see. I guess our imagination translates itself into what we want to actually see, what we want to believe. And when you actually see what Gaiman had in mind, especially, I think it was a series that he actually filmed at one point.
The Neverwhere series?
The Neverwhere series.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of got the gist of what his world actually looked like for Neverwhere.
Yeah, I love how, I don't know, when I watched the Neverwhere series, I didn't watch a whole lot of it, but it was just so grungy and raw, and I just felt like it did such a justice for his books. I think it's interesting because he's just been in the spotlight over the years, starting from like his comic books. What did he start with? The Sandman?
Sandman.
So it's interesting to just see how he's evolved almost from like midlife to where he is now, and how his writings evolved, even from when he wrote American Gods with Terry Pratchett, which I'm a Terry Pratchett fan.
Good Omens, actually.
Was it Good Omens? Okay, I'm sorry. Good Omens, but it was like you can just see the way he changes about, and I think that's what makes him so lovable, is just the way he evolves.
Yeah.
So on this subject, since we are talking about jumping back and forth, I have a word for you. How do you feel about literary synergy?
What is that?
So, literary synergy was actually coined by the author, book reviewer, and Pulitzer Prize winner Julia Keller. And she believes that you can find coexistence and like different chains of understanding through the literary world by reading multiple books.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
So what would that mean to you?
Well, again, when you brought up Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, it's a lot easier to read Terry Pratchett. You could like consume his books so easily just because it's his writing style.
I feel like it's just like witty. He's like just a natural storyteller.
Right.
You know?
But the pacing of Neil Gaiman, like, it's a little slower, to be honest. With his books, it's always like, it's really cool, really fast, and you feel like you could actually like fall into it. But then midway, there's like a pause. It feels like there's fillers. But with Terry Pratchett, he just picks up, and you just have to catch up with him. He's like the fastest old guy you've ever actually walked the freaking hills with. And it's that kind of, switching from one book to the next. I mean, like, you realize what Terry Pratchett's writing style is, and picking up Good Omens, you could tell who's writing which chapter, or which person actually finished which sentence. And that kind of, synergy, as you mentioned, it helps you as a reader to kind of more understand your taste, your likes, and your skill level in reading, and your palette for reading. I mean, I could read about like the most boring books, and for some reason I could plow through them, you know?
Could you elaborate on that?
Okay, I guess one of them I would consider boring for our audience is Mafia Princess by Thomas C. Renner. The book actually are nothing but transcriptions and copies of the criminal records of Sam Giancana. He had a lot to deal with the Cuban Missile paranoia. Basically, he took over the black mafia business to actually build up the Italian mafia business, and he was such a peacock about it. Now, the whole book is actually a confession of his daughter over what she remembers during said periods between these criminal records. And be so frustrated over how often she will bring up her teenage years and how many of the same exact story she will repeat, only to, I guess, give you an insight over one particular detail, just to connect some of the dots.
So, not to get off the subject, but I mean, you basically switch books back and forth because if you hit like a frustrating point in the book, you don't necessarily want to give up on it, but you would like a break from it.
Yeah.
Well, I know for me, I just actually checked my Goodreads before this. I usually juggle between 4 to 5 books. One thing that I do a lot of to break the stress is I'll read a classic novel that I want to take things from, but I'm not necessarily able to indulge in. And I'll read it over even like 2 years at a time. One thing I'm working on right now is Masters of Margarita. It's a Russian classic. I've been reading it for about, I think about 4 years now, but it's really hard to read because it was actually written during the Surrealist movement, so everything goes absolutely crazy. I mean, there's talking cats, there's like psychotic priest. The author actually kills himself and has a funeral in the book, so I can only take so much of that, But it's a book that's definitely on my TBR, which is to read list.
Which is interesting. I remember at the same time you were reading Marquez.
Yes. Okay. Marquez was wonderful. And, like, speaking of literary synergy, it's just one thing I love to do is I like to hop back and forth with a different culture. So it's Russia versus Spain. Like, it was just interesting to see the way they deal with passion or reasoning, or the way they deal with, like, character personas, like educated or humble or classic. Like, there's different approaches to it, and I really appreciate that.
Well, being that, was it the fact that these characters that, within these books that actually intrigued you, or was it actually more the premise? I mean, I know Masters of Margarita actually has an occult following, and Marquez could be considered a cult here in the U.S. Being right. she's like the J.K. Rowling of the Hispanic world. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts? Like, what actually attracted you to read either of them?
So ironically, both of those books were recommended by the same person. And shout out to her. She actually is a literary graduate from Yugoslavia. So when we first started working with each other, we really had... We just loved exchanging books, because my reading list was completely different from hers. Her reading list was completely different from mine. So, like, we just wanted to see what made each other tick. And I could see just the way that romance is handled differently as opposed to here. And I think what kept me going was just the subtlety of everything.
Were you able to finish both books at the same time?
No. So I ate up Of Love and Other Demons by Marquez, which I highly recommend. It was just such a fascinating, almost modernized fairy tale. But I also loved, like, just the way that the time jump was. Like, it kept going back and forth from, like, medieval era almost to modern day archaeological finds and so on and so forth. It was the story, like, I don't want to give everything away, but the first chapter is basically they find this archaeological dig, and they find this, like, royal tomb. They cut it open, and the entire corpse is covered in red, auburn, fiery hair. Like, it's never died. It's just these, like, oodles and oodles of mounds, like Rapunzel, of red hair. And that's kind of, like, the legend behind it.
Okay. So, were you able to actually finish
Masters of Margarita?
Yes.
No. So I am probably roughly around 20% done with that book. But if people know anything about that book, it's kind of like C.S. Lewis's Shrew Tape Letters, where there was an article that would come up in the news or in the press like every week. And so these chapters were written upon that, and it was actually propaganda.
Okay.
So he was a surrealist and he was a propagandist, and he had his own little article section, and this book was written in a slew of that during the war.
Right. But how long did that take you?
Oh my goodness. I'm about 8 hours in, and I would say that I'm like 20%, but it took me about 4 years.
4 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, I know my reading habits is I try to start the new year with a classic. I don't know, it's something that's important to me, is I try my best to, like, get my classic literatures in.
Right.
And then I toggle from there. Like, usually I will swap to a memoir. I find myself reading a lot of required reading books from high schools, because I teach essay writing, and I need to know what these kids are talking about, or I need a refresher. So currently I'm reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's interesting because I guess my literary education wasn't always in American literature. I, like, always seem to be reading British or just European literature as a whole. So it's almost like a new, fresh thing for me.
That's interesting, because, hear me out, I'm a slow reader. And I go right ahead and socialize a lot with people. But in that, I do like a good break. And when I have a break, I tend to pick up some of the books that I have actually kind of set aside. Again, I've brought up Mafia Princess. Another one was The Art of the Heist, by Miles J. Connor Jr.
I noticed you bring those books with you everywhere. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
I know when you have a stressful day, you want to escape every once in a while. And a lot of times, like, my phone doesn't represent entertainment for me. To me, it's communication, you know? Like, I will find a way to communicate with you on Instagram, on Facebook, and I will post and repost. And sometimes looking at a screen is just stressful. So a book, when it's not on a device, makes me feel like I'm free. I'm unplugged. And I take like almost a year sometimes with some of my books. And I'm okay with that because half the time a lot of people don't like the books I read anyways.
right.
You know, it's like my little island, if you could say so.
So on that, one thing I want to bring into this podcast is a little bit of research, and I brought up Julia Keller earlier with her literary synergy. I dabbled lightly and researched her, and I'm going to link this on our blog, but one really great, I guess, interview she did was with NPR in 2010. It was aired on the radio. The title was called The Joys of Reading and Many Books at Once, where she talks to other people that call in and exactly what we're doing right now. We're talking about why we read multiple books at a time. But since you were talking about that, the joy of just easing into the read and the solace of it, I pulled a quote from that transcription, and I thought it would be very appropriate. I also thought it was really appropriate for the reason why we called our podcast Biblio Sinensis. That's because it has tea in it. So this is her quote. For one thing, we don't have those long stretches of not only leisure time, but time without interruption. Interruption from other kinds of things. The phone ringing, or the kids coming home from school, or maybe the boss hollering over your shoulder. We live in a very different way. I mean, there are television sets everywhere. You can sit at the departure gate at the airport now without being assailed by the noise of a television set right over your head. So we've lost those quiet spaces and our leisure moments in many cases. So I do worry that maybe some of this rushing around restlessly from book to book is more of a symptom of our times rather than a good thing. But it's a habit that I can't break at this point. It's that I've been doing it since I was, old enough to read, and I just find it to be a source of pleasure and delight to know that there's always something else. Don't tell me what you're reading, tell me what you're reading next. That is her quote.
That's wonderful. I mean, in that, you're reading European writers. Mm-hmm. When they translate, does it ever feel like you get that feeling of, I guess, their colloquialism in their books?
I feel it's very meditative.
Meditative?
I think I am not a romance reader. I would love to have romance. I'm like every other girl. But the way Marquez wrote romance was very meditative. And I really appreciate it.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But in that, I guess, your sense of escapism, is it more of a casual thing, or do you treat it like it's business? Like, you gotta finish this book.
So, a little bit of both. I mean, if I'm doing a required read, I obviously try to enjoy it as much as possible. To Kill a Mockingbird, my goodness, you've heard me play the audiobook. You can't stand it. Sometimes I need a break from it, but I try to enjoy it as much as I can. I feel like it's almost like traveling. Like, a really good historical or period piece will really transport you. A guilty pleasure of mine is I really love Victorian literature. And I'm not saying that to be a stereotype. I love the wordiness and the mannerisms that go into a piece of descriptive literature from the Victorian era. It's just a style that you can very much tell. And they don't try to be witty or try to make extra of it. It's almost like they're writing a love letter just describing the scene. And I really appreciate that.
Are you talking like actual Victorian? Because I know a lot of people like to talk that they know Victorian, but they're usually talking about Regency books.
Okay,
as well.
so I I guess I have to confess, I'm not really a big fan of Regency writing, which I was bringing up, like, just that wittiness. I appreciate wittiness from time to time, but I hate that reading through the cracks sort of stuff. Like,
Right.
I kind of like to read the descriptions of the scene. I mean, I'm sure if there's any Tolkien fans out there, you know what I'm talking about. I know he's not Victorian, but that descriptive is almost in every single piece of Victorian literature I've read. I'm actually reading Carmille right now, which took me forever to find. It's one of the first literary pieces about female vampires, because we hear about Dracula, and Dracula, like, sucked me, and I loved reading that. I loved reading Woman in White, you know, that sort of thing, but Carmille is, like, almost not only, like, female, but it's about young vampires. And it's like that love story relationship is there. Not like, I love you, you love me, let's get together. This is about two girls, like two young girls from like prominent families, like almost having like this loving relationship for each other out of not just valor per se, but just commonality. And I love reading that sort of connection. I love reading that sort of stuff.
Well, from what it sounds like, you transverse from Victorian literature and almost to 20th century type literature.
I read a lot of classic comic books.
Because no,
as well. So if you're talking modern, I mean, if you really want to know.
No, I'm talking like Guy de Maupassant.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
like that's not really Victorian, is it?
I don't know. I can check.
Yeah.
I think he would be roughly on the cusp. I mean, he was born in 1850. He died in 1893.
Right.
So I would say pre-Victorian.
Is it pre? Okay.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, you start melding almost chronologically with your authors, not book-wise. Like, when your authors have lived, you know, from Victorian period, you go even into the lost generations. And I guess that idea of wordiness, you know, still prevails there, does it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I get it, like, you know, Hemingway practically, like, busted, you know, out of that and created, like, one-syllabic, you know, sentences. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, a majority of the flappers and Lost Generation were writing in, I guess, long-winded sometimes? Was this sentences?
I feel like that era really tried to bring in, I guess, the vastness of opportunity in their writing, if that makes sense. Like,
right.
When I read The Great Gatsby, I feel like he's trying to express the expanse of opportunity when he describes things. And that's how he goes towards that.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's really just style. Different varieties of style. I mean, like we were going into classical required reading. I mean, do you have a particular style that you jump back and forth from?
I know that I've jumped between Dumas and Arturo Perez Reverte.
So kind of modern.
Yeah, I mean, the language in it is so flowery. You know, like, even taking out a sword sounds like he's trying to describe an epic. Mm-hmm. And then when I jump to modern style writing, even though it is about swashbuckling too, Arturo Perez Reverte, his most infamous ones are Dumas Club and The Fencing Master. Mm. He tries to be flowery. It just doesn't work. He gets to the point.
So maybe, I don't know, like I'm hearing this trend of like, maybe you like hearing the homage to that particular author. Because if it's called the Dumas Club, clearly, right? But going back to that literary synergy, I mean, is it because they're both like duelist books? So they have that commonality in theme, but you're seeing like a modern version of it versus the classic or the original?
Pretty much. But I am really particular when it comes down to writing styles. And when I read, one writing style, I kind of need a break. It's like listening to a friend talk about like this girl that he likes for so long, and you just get tired of it after a while. So you got to talk to somebody that, I don't know, has a real hobby like fishing. And sometimes that actually, helps you kind of get through your day. Like, you like talking. You love to converse. And you love hearing people. And that's what you do when you get into these books. You ask questions, and they talk. And you ask more questions, and they talk. And sometimes they don't get to the point.
So what I'm hearing from you is, I guess it's the flattery or the mimicry that you're interested in?
Yeah, at the time I was actually skipping between those two books. And I loved sword fights, the duels. Like, there was like a sense of intensity between, characters when, a guy takes out a sword. All of a sudden the other guy takes out another sword.
But the dialogue overall, like, with that intensity, it gets exhausting.
It does. It really does.
So, all in all, you're basically saying you're kind of just taking a breath and you're enjoying those fights in detail. It's kind of like, I don't know, you'll hear this with film buffs. Jump cuts. Yeah. Jump cut scenes, how they're just exhausting. And sometimes, like, I know everybody makes fun of the famous Michael Bay, just the constant bang and boom. Like, it's hard to digest the actual plot because there's constant movement and the camera's being shifted around versus, like, I guess older films.
I mean, you go right ahead and bring up a Humphrey Bogart movie, and suddenly everybody that was able to capture every single scene in the first Transformer movie just goes to sleep. But then you get a romantic that actually enjoys that kind of pace, and they're enamored by it. They'll talk about it for decades. And anyone that could actually do both, do both. Suddenly you have somebody that has some sort of dynamic wit to them, because fighting robots versus, Humphrey Bogart. I mean, let's just say Humphrey Bogart, for those that actually understand what Humphrey Bogart is all about. How
about Errol Flynn?
Oh my god, Errol Flynn. That guy's fun. Guy's fun. I mean, you go right ahead and talk about swashbuckling. The guy puts a smile to your face whenever a blade gets to your neck.
It's so sassy.
I know, right?
I guess to sum up what we're saying is it's okay to jump from book to book.
It is.
And I think it's pleasurable to jump from book to book. It stimulates.
It does.
Without going into further detail, because I really want people to listen to that interview, The Joys of Reading Many Books, and we'll link that in our blog. But people were discussing over, like, being students and having to read textbooks and how they needed a break, and how different times of the day require different types of reading. Like, one thing they touched on was poetry in the evening, how it's just a very, almost like a blunt, digestible, meditative. And you're not just, like, whittling away at these stories with, like, like a busy mind before bed. I mean, yeah. To end this session, or the subject of book jumping, I have one more article, which actually was the article that allowed me to understand and learn about Julia Keller, and that's by Sadie Trombetta. I hope I'm saying that. Sadie Trombetta. I hope I'm saying that. It's she's an authoress on Bustle. She's an articleist. She writes articles about book reading and just everything in general. So I'm sure in future podcasts we'll probably be touching into more of her articles. But she made a list, and her article is titled Reading More Than One Book at a Time actually has some pretty incredible benefits. I thought we would go through the list of the 7 points and see what it means to the both of us as completely different readers. What do you think?
Sure. Let's go for it.
Okay. So, The first point is reading multiple books at once helps you get through to be read pile faster. TBR pile.
Yes, I have a huge palette for stories and opinions because of it.
Okay.
How about you, though?
Yes. Sometimes what I do, which is kind of a cheat for me, but it's still literature, I'm not going to deny it, is if I get really tired of just constantly visualizing words on and on and on, I go into a comic book. And I've been catching up on a lot of my classic DC, so, I mean, it's a really nice break. Alright. Number 2, it lets you balance your pleasure reading with your required reading. I think I touched on that pretty heavily.
Yeah. I mean, required reading for me, because I'm an editor for a publishing house that takes care of construction books, is I have to read technical books all the time.
Okay.
And when you read nothing but instruction, most of your day, you have to actually find a way to, I guess, relieve yourself. Like, kind of tell yourself, like, hey, you're human too. You're not just a robot,
right.
And it's kind of ironic because as an editor, you have to actually have your own voice to add on to a textbook. So, figure that one out.
See, I know this is funny, but I actually like reading textbooks. But I can't read them all the time. I just love the structure of a good textbook. Like, just the bullet points and, like, what they want you to... Like, what they want to make sure you get out of it.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that more. I mean, I graduated as a bachelor's in graphic design. So I guess I see that, like, visual... And like, I guess, list structure, and there's like something soothing about that.
I'm very happy to hear that, because a majority of an editor's day is rechecking and then rechecking. And oh, by the way, rechecking. And by the way, let's recheck that again.
It's not a very glamorous job.
Oh, no. It's fine.
Okay. All right. Number 3. Likewise, it can give you an opportunity to balance emotional reads with more lighthearted books. I think we talked about that with your Dumas and Perez point.
Yes.
Okay, so from the books that I lightly mentioned in terms of, like, Victorian, I'm sure everyone's noticed I read a little bit of the dark stuff. Which is interesting, because when I read it, I don't really think, like, this is dark and terrible and horrible. Like, I kind of, like, digest it analytically.
Okay.
Like, just the way it pulls the plot and, like, why things have to be extreme. But it's still very heavy. So I do need a break from it.
Okay. I used to work at a bookstore before, and a lot of foreigners actually ask, how do you speak proper English? Like, how can you speak better? And I always throw them, guilty pleasure of mine. I think it's funny, but it's also kind of right. Throw them a Lost Generation book. Like, it's not colloquially like English for us, but if you actually pick those up, they actually understand the English verse so well that they can dissect it for you, and they can actually play with it with you. And if you can get through that, then good. I mean, I don't know. I feel strange for it, because that's not a light read. Or I think it's not.
It does have dark themes.
Right, but...
I mean, I would say sex, drugs, and murder would probably be a dark theme.
Well, it's pretty light compared to the Mafia Princess, like cutting up bodies and actually throwing them into, like, a ditch or something. It's like, yeah. Life is stranger than fiction.
Okay, number 4. It can reveal unexpected connections between unrelated titles. Again, literary synergy, and she brings that up in here.
It was kind of funny, because it was one summer I was, like, obsessed and trying to actually learn poetry. Like, learn every style of poetry. Like, I went from, like, sonnets and villanelles to rimas and, haikus, and even the American sentence. And I found a lot of Spanish literature through it, to be honest. I fell in love with Vallejo. I fell in love with Nicanor Parra. half the time it's not going to make sense to you unless you actually understand some Spanish. You know, it's a huge, like, Hispanic humor behind it. And a lot of people don't realize, like, the type of temper, the type of humor that a different language will actually do to you. Because you start realizing, like, yeah, you know, as Americans, we love to be either corny or play with words, but you've never played with words until you've spoken Spanish. You've read Spanish. Like, dude, they play with words faster than you could actually even say hi. But it's just I guess the culture behind it. And no one knows that Nicanor Parra was actually the rival of Pablo Neruda. Huh. And Pablo Neruda, obviously, if you've actually visited the poetry section in any bookstore, you'll see him.
It's the flowery covers that come out during Valentine's Day. And
exactly. I mean, who would you prefer choosing? The communist that actually enjoys romantic Spanish poetry? Or would you actually prefer the math teacher that kind of taught, this, what's that concept? That dark dimension. I forgot. Oh my goodness. I can't believe I forgot it. Either way, he actually was into the whole concept of
quantum?
Yes.
Is it quantum?
He was digging into the quantum physics.
Like roughly around
like
there.
parallel universes and such, you know.
So, I love reading historical biographies because it gives you when things were published, who their friends were. And when you find out who their friends are, you find new authors. Okay,
so when you actually say friends are, are you talking about, I guess, the Lost Generation? Oh, is this that kind of friend? Or
anything. I mean,
because the Lost Generation was in just one community in Paris, was it?
It was, but the more I read, like, for example, I've been reading this book called Flappers. I'll have to get the authoress's name. I actually got it on my bachelorette party because I'm like that boring fuddy-duddy that decided to have a bachelorette party at a museum. So I took it as a token, and I absolutely adored it, but because of that, I was able to find the authoress Georgette Hayes. And she's kind of an interesting thing because she was a flapper that wrote about Regency romance. And so you get that, like, sassy kind of, like, rebellious take that you would have in a flapper in her writing style, but she writes about, like, dandies and, you know, Minutemen and swashbucklers and your type of thing.
Yeah.
And very interesting authoress. I can't wait to read more of her stuff. I just finished reading The Black Moth by her. It was a super fun read. It totally felt like an Errol Flynn sort of movie in book form. Yeah. Because Errol Flynn was sort of from the 1920s, but they were doing more of that, like, you know, classical sort of, like, girls and villains and, you know, saving the princess and swashbuckling. And she does that sort of writing, but she's a flapper.
Right.
So, you know, that's, again, literary synergy.
Exactly.
So, shall I move to the next point?
Yes, please.
It allows you to take advantage of all the benefits of reading.
What benefits do you consider when you are a reader?
Let's see. Well, she mentions stress relief, entertainment, work or fun. Or you need a pick-me-up, or you need something lighthearted, or maybe you swap over for some humorous essays. Maybe you're interested in traveling, so you read some historical fiction. But swapping around, basically, you get the best of that genre when you need it.
Right. Okay. Well, I guess that coincides again with the analogy I had about, you know, flipping channels when you were watching TV. You actually learn more about the world because you skip from the news all the way to, like, a cartoon or something. And you get both pop culture and, like, that reality fix. Mm-hmm. And you get to have conversations because of that. I mean, like, a lot of people actually enjoyed Power Rangers as kids. And a lot of parents actually had a lot of, I guess, hatred against anything that was kind of new and didn't feel like their type of genre.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay, because I've noticed that even in the book world. You know, like, I've met people that will preach Louis L'Amour and, Orson Scott Card. And as much as our generation enjoys Orson Scott Card, it's actually Endgame, if you guys, the whole sci-fi genre of
like,
it.
only one of the biggest sci-fi movies that came out.
And
I've watched the movie, I haven't read it. I'll admit it now, but I'm not really into trend books. So, I'm working on it. I'm really proud of myself. I just finished a book that was published in 2020, and it is 2020. And it was totally out of my comfort zone, but it was really good as an audiobook. It was the Fifth Avenue Storyteller Society.
Right.
And it was a romance book, but I thought it was so interesting because it was through 5 different characters talking about their stories and, like, overcoming, like, their mental obstacles.
It's ironic because it's your first romantic novel, right?
I've read things that happen to be romance novels. Like, I've been on and off reading Rosalind Miles, and she's one of my favorite, like, sort of historical writers in, like, telling the King Arthur story.
Yeah.
Because I love the way she portrays Guinevere, and how Guinevere isn't just this damsel that betrays the king. She actually has layers. It talks about, like, pagan culture and how queenships were different from kingships. And I love that sort of stuff. And I always end up finding myself accidentally reading romance novels for that sake. Like, I just read one I didn't just read one. It was like a few years back, but the history of Esther, the biblical Esther. But it was a kind of a romance novel, but it was more about, like, how Jewish culture was back then and how they were sort of nomadic and people considered them barbaric, and nobody really talks about that anymore, and how, like, this Assyrian culture was, like, totally, refined, and, like, they thought they were backwards, and, like, some of the mourning processes and yada yada. But I find myself sucked into that stuff.
Right.
As opposed to, and it happens to be a romance novel, but I guess I never really see it as a romance novel because I'm too engrossed with this world.
Well, that's the funny thing. Because, like, again, I'm talking about, like, the old generation and the new generation when it comes down to taste and opinions. Like, the old generation, their romance novel was the chic. It's still the chic, And nowadays, we're watching, like, let's see, The Notebook.
It reminds me of something that I feel is a common mistake with new writers.
Yeah.
And we can go further into, like, people who become from readers to writers and they start writing. But one mistake I see a lot of when I'm teaching kids is they want to be everything. They want to be the romance novelist. They want to be the sci-fi writer. They want to be the cool guy, the action. And I feel like, pick one thing you're really good at and just write about it and happen to have those other things in it. I just feel like it will follow.
Yeah.
But I feel like with her point here, there's nothing wrong with being, like, one of the umpteenth million sci-fi writers. If someone needs to escape into a sci-fi novel, then they need to, or a fantasy writer. If someone needs a feel-good memoir or an empowering you got this girl #boss babe type of memoir, then they need that, They really do. I go to books for that too,
Right.
It's camaraderie.
It is.
Yeah.
And being that, everyone is able to kind of develop as readers. And if you actually are in the industry of, writing and literature, even academia, the most important people are actually readers, not writers. Your value is in reading.
Right.
And the reason for it is because if you weren't a reader in the first place, why were you writing?
Right.
Why did you think that was important? it's a culture in itself because we want to have an identity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the good ways to develop it.
Well, our identities are based upon stories and experiences, so
Exactly.
it's how we digest the world. I mean, isn't that, as a whole, why books are written? Because we're digesting the world, we're digesting the information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that itself is a value.
Okay. So, speaking of digesting, let's move to the 6th point. It allows you to enjoy books in many mediums.
We were there already.
I totally brought that up with the graveyard book reference earlier in this podcast. Like, I didn't really truly enjoy the graveyard book until I saw the comic book.
Okay.
I thought it was very cleverly written, but I don't think I got the actual grasp, the depth of the hidden story that Gaiman was trying to do until I read the novel and kind of saw a visual. Like, I got to see, the vampire character be sad or the vampire character be protective. And I got to see all the ghosts and the way they interact with Bod and, the main character. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Okay, that's lovely. I mean, in that, was a transition easy for you? Like,
it felt like a completely different set of people in the same town. Almost like a trilogy.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was really cool and really refreshing for me.
Right.
What's another book that I've... Oh, okay, so here's another one. One of my favorite memoirs is actually Julia Child, My Life in France. I could not stand the audiobook to save my life. It just didn't have that pull in.
Right.
Reading the visuals and creating your own version of Paris along with Julia, and the way the food tasted versus hearing someone talk about how the food tasted, it was it just didn't work.
Right.
It didn't connect with me. Different varieties. Do you find yourself audiobooking one thing and then reading another thing?
Yeah, I made the really, really bad mistake of actually listening to The Three Musketeers.
I've made that mistake too, and honestly, I'm still beating myself up because I think I was about 80% through and I just didn't finish it.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's one thing when you read it. You feel like you could actually be Dumas and actually enjoy the fact that half the book is actually about their squires, screwing around and doing their best, It felt like I was watching the movie Losers, they're a bunch of professionals, they know what they're doing, but they are also young and teenagers, and they're trying to actually do their job, trying to help D'Artagnan and all the musketeers, try to fix everything and really just screw with their money.
Okay, do you want to hear something weird? I hate audiobooking scripts. I love reading them.
That makes
I feel
sense.
so different.
It's like when you actually watch a live reading of a script as opposed to an audio version of that script.
Yeah.
There's a beauty to that. I mean, who's a favorite author of yours when it comes down to that?
Ibsen.
Ibsen?
Dollhouse is so horrible.
Yeah.
To me. Well, no, it wasn't Dollhouse. Which was yeah, Dollhouse. And then there was another one. I don't think Ibsen wrote it.
Personally, for me, I loved Shaw's writing. Mm-hmm. But I do not like Shaw as a person. I mean, if you've actually read, the stuff he writes afterwards, of course this happens, and of course that happens, and logically, blah, blah, blah. I was
so
this eugenics, fanatic just comes out.
It's interesting because, I feel when I read Shaw, it feels like the same universe, even though they're different time periods.
Right.
I read Pygmalion, and then I picked up his version of Caesar and Cleopatra.
Right.
And I really liked the way he portrayed Cleo in that one, but it just felt like the same genre. I felt like I was listening to The Professor and Eliza Doolittle all over again, you know? Like,
yeah,
It
if anything, I really recommend people to try to read Eugene O'Neill. He's actually a lot more fun to read than he is to actually perform sometimes. Because his descriptions go on for pages. And it feels like you're supposed to be reading a novel, but he's such a good scriptwriter. You know? And you just can't help but fall into that, into his books. More so than his plays. And I'm not like tearing Eugene O'Neill plays apart here. Like, good God, I would love to actually visit the Eugene O'Neill Theater someday if it's still around. I'm not sure. I gotta check.
We'll check.
We'll check. But like, really, it's the scripts that you could actually pick up sometimes are just phenomenal.
Well, here's in terms of scripts, something I know we kind of made a tradition here in our house is I buy you a Fantastic Beasts script every time a new movie comes out.
Yeah, so far there's 2.
So far we have 2.
We have 2.
But that's something we just make it a point.
That's true. I mean, right now, script I'm actually like looking into buying someday is Good Omens, because I loved the books when they came out. Well, it's just one book, guys, but the problem I have is I collect the book over and over again. And the script came out, and to me that's like, oh my god, I finally have a fandom to actually continue. I mean, I get it, a majority of it is actually being fanned by the actors. Like, yes, they have a gay relationship. Ha ha ha, they totally had. And I'm like, I'm cool with that. So as long as it stays alive, I love Good Omens. That's like, to me, that's like childhood, even though it was like back in high school for me. You fall for it, you know? Reading is beautiful in that sense. So
on that note, the last point she brings up.
Oh, there's a last point.
Is variety is the spice of life, especially everyday life.
Wait, is she repeating herself?
No.
I mean, what does that mean at this point?
Well, reading a variety of books, it gives you the spice of life. It gives you a little something different every day.
That kind of makes sense. I mean, let's say this. I'm a guy, and I like opera. That's hard for some girls to actually swallow. In fact, sometimes I think they think I'm lying until I actually start talking about the plot. And half of them fall asleep when I show them the DVD. You know what I mean? Come on, guys. Are you not entertained? But nevertheless, it does, I feel. It gives you a personality. It draws you out as an individual. I mean, like, I've met a lot of goths that actually say we are all individuals, not knowing what that phrase actually means. And they fall victim to a fad sometimes. They treat it as a fad, and then only, like, I guess the lifers kind of come out of it decades later to actually say, no, this is me. And that's their identity. But as readers, I feel almost like we can't get into a fad unless you were, like, reeled in with just the groupies. And in that, I have to question, did you read the book? Did you actually read the book? Because when you read a book, you're having a conversation with the author. That gives you, I guess, a new set of weapons to use in a conversation. And I guess that's it. I mean, like, it did give me a good perspective over life, in one sense. I mean, Luis Jorge Borges is afraid of dying. You know, he was afraid of his reflection. And people loved reading his stuff, but he wasn't even a collegiate graduate. He's like, the Italian I know is from Inferno. That's what I know, which makes total sense because, you know, Italian is actually Florentine, and Florentine was the selected language that became the universal Italian. So it's like having Shakespeare being the universal English. But nevertheless, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it made me a better person because I got to actually think.
Right.
And a lot of people don't think.
I feel like, on that note, books was like a daily, like, point of routine for me that I needed. There was like a low point in my life where I just felt like my brain was just this diarrhea, just this day in, day out. And it was the idea of books. And I talked to you about this. It's the idea of seeing not only a world outside of you, but a way of answering the problems in that world outside of how you would answer those problems. And it really got me to think of different ways to problem solve my current situation. And I got myself out of it because of that alternative thinking.
I guess another thing I could actually add to that is I had problems with a relationship and I needed to actually reconnect. The deal was the person I was in a relationship with loved an array of things, and it was hard to kind of catch up with her. So I had to kind of come to grips that, you know what, I gotta find some sort of connection. And one of the things I thought I could connect with her was through reading. She called me out as a bad poet. So I was like, okay, what makes a good poet? So from Shakespeare all the way to Ginsberg, I read. I was a little troubadourian, trying to understand this world of literature. And ironically, I kind of felt like I ended up in the other side of the river. Like having my own opinion about those books. But because I had an understanding of literature, I was able to bridge that gap again. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of, like, the Fitzgeralds, but she loves it. And I at least could have an opinion about it. So, I guess that's one of the things that I kind of, gotta thank books for.
So, I guess we end the conversation here. We'd love to hear from all of you. We will give you a link to an email, but we'd love to get letters. If you enjoyed this podcast, please drop us a line and email us. Maybe we'll feature your comments before we start the next episode in episode 2. We're not that far yet. But we'd love to hear your opinions, and we'd love this to just be a conversation. As you saw with the logo, this is a book and tea driven conversation. We are drinking tea Spectral tea. I am the tea hauntier, Stephanie. And we are currently drinking Daydreamer. Daydreamer is the first, I guess, love child I've ever created in tea Spectral. I actually created it in honor of Kip, who is a cloud chaser and happens to be the mascot for Azure Lorica. Azure Lorica is our nonprofit. We've had her for 10 years. We believe in connecting artists with people who are craving art and vice versa, but we believe that it doesn't have to be done in a expensive manner. We also highly encourage the education and the craft behind it. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, that actually sounds pretty great, to be honest. I mean, Azure Lorica is a nonprofit for anti-bullying lately.
Lately, our theme has been anti-bullying. In fact, we are in the works of creating something fun for all of you Biblio Sinensis listeners to get involved. We will be raising money for the charity, the Elevation Society. And the Elevation Society is actually, I guess it's a nonprofit that does lectures and discussions on suicide.
They prevent suicides
Through conversation.
Through conversation and through their programs.
Right.
A lot of the statistics I actually was impressed by was that the numbers haven't actually raised since 2017. I'm happy about that.
Yes.
But it's only because we have nonprofits like this that have been able to actually curve the spike. We're hoping to not to actually prevent that spike from ever happening. We want it to go down. We want the numbers of suicide to go down.
Yeah, and the founder of this nonprofit, which I had the honor of meeting her, we had her do a lecture at one of our Fan Film Awards events. She did this because her best friend, actually committed suicide. She said that the signs were there, but she just didn't know how to deal with it. So she educated herself based on that experience, and she wants to equip family members and loved ones of people who have suicidal tendencies with how to properly address and deal with that. And I think that that's such a loving way of doing it as opposed to just research. It's a very hands-on, one-on-one nonprofit. So if that's something you're interested in helping us raise money for, that's something we will talk about in the future. But Daydreamer, the tea, is a lovely blend of rose, lavender, Earl Grey, and passion fruit is the interesting note in the end of it. We hope you can get your hands on some of it. If you'd like to learn more about it and maybe some of the books that inspired it or books to pair with it, we will have that on the blog as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
And catch us on bibliosinensis.com.
Yes. Cheers.
Cheers.
Until next time.